Welcome to Corson's Corner, a protective strategy podcast to help you succeed in staying safe. My name is Spencer Corson. I am a threat management expert, and today I would like to talk to you about threats. There were a lot of articles in my news feed this week regarding threats on an entire host of issues. There was one about the increase in threats facing politicians. I think that one was from Vice. Big tech was targeted after the CEOs from Amazon, Google, Apple, and Facebook were invited to Capitol Hill under threat of subpoena. And most tragically, the son of Judge Esther Salas was shot and killed at her home in New Jersey. Her husband was also injured in the attack. And though the judge herself was not injured, U.S. Marshals have now placed her under 24-hour protection and are investigating whether there is any connection between the prior threats the judge had received and the shooting. Now, obviously, when assessing any determination of risk, you want to take into account the totality of circumstances surrounding that threat. Because like most things, context matters. But by their very intention, threats are scary, and no matter how they were intended or directed, it is very possible that those threats can make us feel anxious or even fearful. So today specifically, I would like to talk about a question that arises most often when I'm in consultation with my clients, which is how to know when a threat is real. But to answer that question, we first need to establish an understanding of what a threat is in the first place. So what is a threat? A threat is a statement of intention to inflict harm to your physical self, your health, your wealth, your stature, your social standing. And in most cases, it's because someone has a grievance, be it real or imagined. They believe that some measure of retaliation is required in order to remedy their concern. Now, sometimes those threats are very direct. I'm going to kill you. Sometimes those threats are veiled, and these are like what we see in like the tough guy movies. You know the last guy that insulted me, he wound up regretting it. And other times those threats are conditional. They are the if this then that framework of a threat. And we grew up with these conditional threats. Our parents telling us if we don't stop throwing a temper tantrum, they're going to take away our toys, give us a timeout. But in all of these examples, the aggrieved person did not, at least in that moment in time, do anything outright to harm us. Instead, they simply chose to alarm us because threats are ultimately the poor man's power play to influence outcome. They are the checkers of an intimidation tactic. Now, obviously, words are easy to say, and social media has only made it easier than ever for individuals to espouse their opinion. But it has made it just as easy for those of a dissenting view to do away with civil discourse and instead choose to retaliate via some propped up perch of irrational keyboard warrior justice. But these threats, they aren't limited to those whose names populate our newsfeed. These threats impact all of us. They impact our everyday life. Women are targeted on dating sites. Men are targeted on sports blogs. There are sexting scams and revenge porn plots and workplace violence concerns that even threaten activism efforts. All of which are at risk of being targeted by someone who wishes to communicate some kind of a threat to disrupt your emotional well-being by threatening your physical safety. Now, the role of threat assessment is to determine how credible that threat may be and how likely that particular threat may escalate into violence. So to help us understand how that all takes place, let's take a look at a bomb threat as an example. Because bomb threats typically fall into two categories, right? There's like the predatory and there's the disruptive. Predatory is when a security guard or a cop or really anyone at all finds, a quote unquote suspicious package or some other telltale sign of an improvised explosive device and then makes the proper notification in order to keep everyone in that particular area safe because there was in fact a legitimate bomb threat. But the second type is disruptive. That's when someone calls in and says there's a bomb, but then offers no proof. Now, why would someone go through all of the trouble to learn how to make a bomb, obtain the materials to make one, then build it, then breach whatever security was in place to, put it inside, then get out clean, only to sabotage all of their efforts by making a phone call? In short, they wouldn't. They just wanted to watch their words cause havoc, or worse, exploit your protocols by having everyone evacuate their secure location into an unsecured area where the real bomb might be waiting. I mean, just do a fire drill search on social media, and you can see exactly where most schools and office buildings tell everyone to go. So here's a pro tip for you. If you're ever in a building or a school or an office park or anywhere at all really, and they are telling you to evacuate, do not go to the evacuation zone. Go home, go to the mall, go to Starbucks, go anywhere, go home, go anywhere else you want. But whatever you do, do not go where they're telling you to go. Get as far away from there as possible. But you know what? Here's possibly an even better example. A few years ago, I was consulting for a TV talk show. They got a lot of fan mails, emails, social media commentary, the works. Most of it was positive. The I love the show, I love you, keep doing what you're doing type of stuff. Some of it was just benign commentary, but some of it was just downright awful, hate-spewing, you suck rhetoric. But we tracked all of it just the same. So one day, an inappropriate communication gets flagged for review, and it gets sent up to my office, and the name really looks familiar. So I enter the threat into the matrix and notice that this guy's been a longtime fan of the show. He's been writing in for years. He's even been to the show on numerous occasions. Now, I wouldn't qualify what the guy said as particularly offensive, but he did communicate a grievance. He said he had been a longtime fan of the show, but after having a particular guest on the show, he felt betrayed and was, quote, really working through some issues about how to handle it. Now, here was a guy who had been a fan of the show for years, who didn't live far away, who had even been to the show a few times, which meant he was intimately familiar with the layout of the studio, how guests were screened, and how much security was on hand. So even though this guy hadn't necessarily expressed a threat, he certainly posed one. And so when we ran his name through the audience list for an upcoming show, and we saw that he was ticketed for a show in a few weeks, we knew we had a very real problem on our hands. Now, that particular concern was able to be managed to a peaceful resolution, but that does bring me to today's protective takeaway, which is this. The biggest misconception about threat assessment is that it's all about that one creepy communication, and it's not. Threat assessment is about the totality of circumstance much more than it is about evaluating a singular communication within the framework of an isolated incident. So, to help you understand what I mean by totality of circumstance, here are 5 things to keep in mind whenever you are looking to determine if a threat is real. Number 1, take all threats seriously. I don't care if they're direct, indirect, veiled, or conditional. A threat is a threat no matter how it was communicated. And no matter how benign or insignificant they may seem, they should all be documented and recorded. Screenshot them, save them, because if a case is to be made against them later, you will want to be able to demonstrate a pattern in practice that shows a clear escalation in their ideation to harm you. Now look, it's very possible that if you just ignore whoever it was that hate tweeted you, that you will never hear from them again. In fact, more often than not, that is very much the case. But if you block them or delete them, you are more likely than not going to give them the satisfaction of having annoyed you that they were looking for. And the last thing you want is them creating another account to harass you, and this thing turning into a game of cat and mouse. So acknowledge, ignore, move on. Number 2, actions speak louder than words. Is this person expressing a threat or are they posing a threat? Think of the difference like this. If you cut someone off in traffic and they start yelling and screaming and honking their horn, then give you the finger as they speed off past you, that person has communicated a threat. But if you cut someone off in traffic and they stay right behind you and go white-knuckled and glared while they follow you home, that person poses a threat. and understanding the difference between these two is a crucial component to determining the level of inherent risk. Number 3, is there a grievance? Saying, "I want to kill you," or "F you," or "I hope you die" are upsetting statements to hear, but they don't communicate any indicator of a grievance. More often than not, these kinds of statements are just an emotional outburst, not a lot of thought behind them, just a fleeting burden of angst they would rather displace onto you than carry themselves. A grievance would be something that would serve as justification for their threat, something like, "You ruined my life, now I'm going to ruin yours." Because, as we talked about with that talk show guy, a threatening person with an underlying grievance is a threat to take seriously. Number 4, look for leakage. Leakage is a pre-incident indicator, a warning sign, a preoccupation with an unresolved grievance. So if you are the target of a threat or some other kind of inappropriate communication, a best practice would be to look online, Google their name, search for their handle, look at what they are posting or tweeting or putting in their stories. If their feed is full of obscene opinions directed toward everyone, then the inappropriate communication or the threat directed against you was very likely just his threat du jour, nothing more. But if there are numerous references made about you, or there are communications to others which mention or at you, you will most certainly want to elevate your concern. For example, if John is tweeting at Jane that he is going to hurt her, the risk to Jane is much lower than if John is tweeting to Jim about how he's planning to hurt Jane. In threat management, indirect threats tend to be a greater source of concern than direct threats because the aggressor is often seeking sympathy for their plight. They are, field testing their justification for moving forward. They're like crowdsourcing permission for their intent to harm you. And number 5, how well do they know you? What is the relationship between the author of the threat and the threatened? Were the two of you in an intimate relationship? Did you work together, have lunch together, live in the same building, go to school together? Did you see each other at the gym? One of the things we look for in threat management is how much time, effort, and energy would be required for the threat to be carried out. Was there ever an instance of violence in your history together? This factor is important because the higher the degree of intimacy coupled with any kind of stalking or threat is a greater indicator of lethality than either behavior alone. So now that we know what we're looking for, what should you do if this sort of happens to you? There are 3 things I recommend everyone do. So regardless of circumstance, do these 3 things. Number 1, document the threat. I don't care if you screen capture it, email it to yourself, or create your own kind of threat management spreadsheet with all the detail you could ever imagine. Do something. Get it on record. What matters most is that if you need to go back and provide a history of bad behavior, that you have everything you need on hand to file a solid report. Number 2, if you are threatened or harassed at any time for any reason, even if it only happens once, report it. If it's on social media, report it to the platform. If it's at work, report it to HR. If it's in your personal life, report it to a friend. When it comes to good protective practice, 2 heads are always better than 1. And just because you may think it's nothing, remember that it's sometimes hard to see the big picture clearly when we're in the middle of a whirlwind. So tell a trusted friend or a confidant what's going on and heed their advice. 2 heads are better than 1. And number 3, if at any time you feel your safety is being threatened, reach out to your resources. Call the police, file a report. Even if no arrestable offense occurred, at least you get your statement on an official record. Reach out to advocacy groups that may have relationships with the DA. Law enforcement often has partnerships with a lot of these social media agencies, and they will take the threat of an investigative effort much more than you just hitting the report button. And finally, research best practices for staying safe. Trust your instincts and trust your gut. Look, the bottom line with all of this is to simply participate in your own safety. Don't ignore or avoid those things that threaten you. Face them head on. The first time may be hard. The second time will be easier. But by the third time, you'll be empowering others by showing that if you can do it, they can too. And that's really what all of this is about. Empowering one another to participate in our own safety and preparing today for a safer tomorrow. So I think we can end this lesson right there. Onward, upward, work, sweat, win, and I'll see you back here next week.